So in the last video, I showed you how we gathered all of the elements needed to make our photo composite, which was inspired by the promotional artwork for The Irishman. If you haven't seen that video yet, then be sure to take a look at it using the link up here. Now in this video, I'm going to show you all of the steps I took in Photoshop to actually piece this bad boy together. So first of all, I imported all of the raw images into Lightroom and began to shortlist the photos I wanted to use. So as you can see here, I'm just quickly skimming through each of the shots using the arrow keys on the keyboard. And then when I come across an image I want to shortlist, I press number 5 on the keyboard, and that will give the image a 5-star rating, which simply means that I'll be able to easily pick these images out right at the end. Also, once I think I've found the image I want to 5-star, before I hit that 5 key, I quickly zoom in a bit closer just to check that everything is nice and sharp and in focus. I'd hate to shortlist it and then export it from Lightroom and figure out that later on down the road it was ever so slightly out of focus or something silly like that. So it's always worth checking critical focus before you shortlist your images. So here are the 3 images I narrowed it down to. Next, I switched over to the develop screen at the top and just made some basic exposure and color adjustments. To help with this, I brought up the original Irishman image so that I could put them side by side and make sure that my adjustments were kind of on the right track. The first thing I noticed was that the shadows on my images are a lot darker than on the original, so I played around with the shadow slider a bit to bring back some of that detail. I also played around with the texture and clarity sliders a bit to add some more detail and give that contrasty, gritty kind of look. I added a bit of sharpening and some slight curves adjustments to bring up the shadows a little bit more, and I was ready to sync all of the changes with the remaining 2 images. Finally, I used the adjustment brush to brighten up the shadowy area on the faces and bring back a little bit more of that detail. Then I was ready to export all 3 photos into Photoshop. With all 3 images opened into Photoshop, it was time to start the arduous process of cutting out the portraits from the background. For this, I chose to use the polygonal lasso tool and I set the feather to 1 pixel. Now, if you don't set the feather to 1 pixel and you keep it at 0, when you cut out your portraits, you'll find that they'll have a really super hard edge to them and it'll be completely obvious that you've cut them out and slapped them onto a new background. But equally, don't set this value too high either, because having something way above 1 pixel will make the edges look really soft and blurry. Alternatively, you could use the pen tool or something like that to cut out your portraits as well. I know some people prefer this method, but personally I'm used to using the polygonal lasso tool and I find that it does a really good job. So once I've finished cutting around the portrait, I simply click Add Mask, and this will mask out the background without actually deleting it. This is sometimes a good option, as it means that if you need to adjust the cutout at a later date, you can just modify the layer mask rather than having to start all over again from the beginning. Just make sure you save off a copy of the image as a PSD file so that you can come back to it later. Now that all of the portraits have been cut out, it's time to do a bit of work on the background. As I mentioned in the previous video, because of the coronavirus lockdown in the UK at the moment, it means I'm unable to leave the house, and that means I can't go into the city centre and take photos myself, which is a bit of a shame. However, I did manage to find this cool image on Shutterstock, which I purchased instead. The colour balance of this image is a little bit too warm as it is, so I started by creating a solid colour layer above the background layer, and then set the colour to a nice deep blue. Then I set the blending mode of this layer to colour, and then reduced the opacity to 50, and that seemed to cool it out to match my portraits. I also quickly removed the white trunking to the left-hand side of the picture by selecting it and using content-aware fill. Now it was time to add in the portraits. As you can see, they're a little bit big for the scene, so I used free transform to resize them, and I did that quickly by pressing Ctrl and T on the keyboard, or Command and T if you're using a Mac. Once the portraits were in the frame, I noticed that the background didn't quite match up with the portraits. It kind of lacked some detail in the shadows and the highlights. So with the background layer selected, I headed up to Image, Adjustments, Shadows, Highlights, and from there I played around with the sliders until I ended up with a result that I liked. After this, I added a curves adjustment layer above the background layer but beneath the portraits so that it only affects the background. And then I added some more contrast onto the background just so that it matched up with the portraits. Now it was time to roughly place the portraits within the scene, again using free transform to scale them. Once I'd got them in place, I wanted to add a bit more separation between the portraits and the background. So I added another curves adjustment layer and brought up the black point a bit just to crush the blacks. Then I added a radial gradient to the layer mask so that the edges of the frame remained dark, but as it got to the centre of the alleyway, it became a bit more hazy and foggy. Next, I wanted to add a bit of blur to the background too, so it looked as if it was the sort of focus fall off from the lens. To do this, I first had to quickly duplicate the background layer and delete the original, then turn this copy of the background into a smart layer. Now, I won't go into too much detail about smart layers here, but essentially one benefit of using a smart layer is that it allows you to apply filter effects to the layer non-destructively. And by that I mean that you can remove them or adjust them at a later date. With normal layers, any filter effects that are applied are permanent. So with the background selected, I headed to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and played around with the sliders until I was happy with the result. Another cool thing with filter effects is that when they're applied to a smart layer, you can even add a mask to that filter. So in this instance, I used a radial gradient mask on the blur filter that I just applied, so that the background image was blurred at the back of the alley, but it became sharper as it got nearer to the portraits, just like a regular photo would. The composition of the image was still bugging me a little bit at this point, so I cropped the image a little tighter and also messed around more with the position and scale of the portraits until I was finally happy, well, for now at least. Now it was time to play with the colours. So I started by adding a curves adjustment layer to the top of the layers palette and brought up the left-hand side of the curves on the blues channel to add a blue tint to the shadows. At this point I felt like the background was still a little bit too bright, so I created a brightness contrast adjustment layer and sat it just above the background layer. I then reduced the brightness, which really helped to add that sort of moody atmosphere to the background. Next I wanted to add a dark vignette to the image to darken the corners and bring attention to the centre of the frame. There's a cool way you can do this non-destructively in Photoshop, and that's by creating a blank new layer, selecting it all by pressing Ctrl and A or Command and A on a Mac, and then heading to Edit, Fill, and setting the contents to 50% grey. Now if you go to Filter and Lens Correction, and under the Custom tab, adjust the vignette sliders until you get the desired result. Once you're happy, set the blending mode for this layer to Overlay, and there you have it. Even with the vignette applied, I felt like the bottom of the frame was still a little bit too bright, so I created a brand new blank layer and then applied a black to transparent gradient over the bottom. I then set the blending mode of this layer to darken and reduce the opacity a little bit. I also made sure to move this layer beneath the curved layer that I created earlier. As I was nearing the end of the editing, I spent a little bit more time clearing up the portrait, getting rid of fluff from the suits and blemishes from the skin using the spot removal tool, but nothing too dramatic. Then I created another 50% grey layer and placed it above George's layer in the layers palette. Using the burn tool with the range set to shadows and the exposure dialed all the way down to 50%, I started to darken around George's arm and create a bit of a shadow. The idea behind this was to help create a bit of separation between Paul in the foreground and George just behind him, and it also made it look a bit more believable by sort of creating a shadowed effect. After even more faffing about with the scale of the portraits, I eventually settled on having my portrait larger in the frame so that it gave the image a bit more depth. Next, I created a bunch more 50% grey layers and clipped them to each of the portraits. To do this, you simply hold the Alt key and click in between the two layers within the layers palette. This will clip the top layer to the bottom one. Then I used the dodge tool set to mid-tones with an exposure of 10% and started to brighten around the eyes of each portrait, trying to avoid the pupils which needed to stay dark. After that I switched to the burn tool and then brushed around the edges of the iris to make them darker. I repeated this process for all three portraits. Yet another 50% grey layer. This time I went to Filter, Noise, Add Noise. Within the window I made sure that the Gaussian option is ticked. This just gives the noise a bit more of a random pattern and looks more like a traditional film grain. I also made sure that monochromatic was ticked to make sure that the grain was black and white. So I set the blending mode to overlay and then reduced the opacity of the layer so that the grain wasn't quite so intense. I also used free transform to scale up the layer a little bit to make the grain a bit thicker and also a bit softer. To finish it all off, I wanted to add in some mist and fog textures to really give the impression that the image was shot in a foggy London back alley somewhere. So I found a bunch of textures online and added them into the file too. Once I'd scaled the first image to size, I then moved it within the layers palette so that it was sat directly beneath the blue solid colour layer that I created right at the start. I also set the blending mode to screen and reduced the opacity to 30%. The second texture I imported, I wanted to sit on top of the portraits, so I made sure it was just above them in the layers palette, I scaled it to size, then set the blending mode to screen and reduced the opacity to 30% as well. One other final little tweak included creating a hue saturation adjustment layer and reducing the saturation slightly just to remove some of the colour. So the very last step involved sharpening. Firstly, I created a flattened copy of my image, and to do this I just quickly pressed Ctrl, Alt, Shift and E on the keyboard. It's a bit of a handful, but it's a good one to remember. Then, after making sure that this layer was now at the top of the palette, I headed to Filter, Other and High Pass. And then I set the radius to 2 and clicked OK. Now all I need to do is set the blending mode for this layer to Overlay. And as you can see, this gives the image a super sharp finish. And there we have the final image. I apologise now if I've glossed over any parts of the editing process. I just wanted this video to be more of an overview of the steps that I took to piece this image together. As you can tell, it was quite a long process, so going over every single step in loads of detail would take just way too long. That said, if there was any part of this video you would like me to look at in a bit more detail, maybe for a different project or in a different video, then be sure to let me know in the comments below. Equally, if you decide to try this technique out for yourself, then don't forget to share your work with our Facebook page and Instagram page, as we'd love to see what you come up with, and who knows, you might be featured in an upcoming video. Anyway guys, that's about it for now. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider giving this video a thumbs up and also subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.